Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today on the ins and outs of divorce with Karen Argetsinger and Larry Kotlikoff. My name is Alex Kotlikoff, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. We're super excited to welcome our friend Karen to our webinar series, and I just wanted to provide a brief background about her. Karen is a collaborative attorney, certified mediator, and advocate concentrating her practice on family mediation, employment law, estate planning, and health advocacy. Karen has her own law practice located in Wellesley, along with an of-counsel position at Hutchings and Barsamian LLP, and sits on the panel of the Dispute Resolution Council, LLC. Karen has worked in the legal field since 1992. Her background includes large law firm experience at Hall & Dorr, along with experience as a law clerk and independent consultant. Karen received her Bachelor of Science at Tulane University and her JD from Massachusetts School of Law. She has a special interest in child advocacy and health policy, as well as facilitating collaboration between attorneys, hospitals, and doctors. And just to say a few things before we begin today, today's webinar, like the previous ones, is a webcast, which means you'll only be able to hear through your computer audio. If you're having trouble hearing, just let me know and I'll see if I can help you. Today's webinar, as is the last one, is being recorded, and we'll be sending out an email along with the PowerPoint slides afterwards, typically a couple days afterwards. After the presentation, we'll transition towards Q&A, which is probably going to be an hour, but if there's lots of questions, we'll continue it. It looks like that Karen and Larry have pretty flexible schedules today, so we'll go as long as we can. Please write your questions in the questions field located on your webinar control panel on the bottom there. We'll try to get to everyone's questions, but as always, we have many folks, and if for some reason we don't get to your question, or your question may be a little off topic, just feel free to email me at alex@economicsecurityplanning.com. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Karen, and we'll begin.
Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. This is a true pleasure. I have just put together a few slides to sort of give you an ins and outs of divorce and different kinds of approaches to try and figure out how to come to a fair settlement. So with that, I will start. So as everybody knows, no two marriages are the same. Therefore, no two divorces will be. And the key to any divorce is really achieving a fair settlement. And how to get there begins by choosing the right approach. And of course, each state has different laws, guidelines, and procedures. So make sure that you speak with a local attorney. Very important to do. So there's different kinds of divorce approaches that I put together. Mediation. One other idea is co-mediating with a marriage counselor. Collaborative law, sort of a hybrid between mediation and litigation, where you stipulate to issues in a mediation forum and present the agreement at the status conference or pretrial. And then there's litigation, where a high percentage of cases actually settle the night before trial. So, sometimes. So I'll explain a little bit about each one of those approaches. For mediation, the couple usually works with a third-party neutral who guides, facilitates, and assists parties to come to an agreement. There are many advantages to mediation, one being time and cost-effective. You can, with the mediator, come up with creative outcomes and solutions. The parties have control over the resolution. And of course, importantly, it's private and confidential instead of being outside in a trial situation. And one of the big positives to this is there's the ability to co-parent and maintain a decent relationship afterwards. How you take that approach really makes a difference. And you're also providing your children with a hypothetical voice at the table. Each time when I do my mediation, I make sure that the couple brings in a picture of the children and puts it on the table so that they continue to focus on what is important the children. And it's always helpful if the mediator is an attorney because the drafting can be accomplished as part of the process. In collaborative law, each party is represented by collaboratively trained counsel, and they all enter a participation agreement to avoid court. So what happens is if it does unravel, these attorneys have to step out because they cannot continue on to the litigation direction. Usually involves financial neutrals and coaches and who play the role of the mediator. And then of course there's litigation, and every case is not right for the alternative dispute resolution. So sometimes it's a good idea to go the litigation route, or at least start that way, if the decision to divorce is unilateral, or there's an inability to work together, or safety issues are involved, or there's concerns about non-disclosure and hidden funds. In general, of course, again, every state is different on how a complaint is filed. Usually, a complaint is filed, served on the spouse, discovery, pretrial, and then hearings, a long process, and you're really at the mercy of the court's timing and ruling, and it is extraordinarily costly. So in general, the divorce issues that are involved in most cases, again, it's different in every state, the waiting periods, the statutory factors, the filing procedures, division of assets. If you're in a community state, that's different. But in general, there's asset and liability division, children issues such as custody, parenting plans, child support, college and emancipation, keeping in mind the standard is the best interest of the children, alimony, for how long and how much, health, dental and vision insurance is part of it, tax filings, implications of transfers of assets, child credits and deductions, filings, how the returns will be filed, head of household, and more recently stimulus checks and the different changes in the tax laws. Also can be miscellaneous items, pets and credit card points and life insurance. So there is a financial impact of divorce, which everybody knows. There's some actual positives to it and negatives, and as Larry will describe later on, how to decide what works. They, of course, are divided based on laws in your state, but it's usually equitable, not necessarily equal. There's asset division, of course, makes the financial impact, dividing of bank accounts, retirement, brokerage accounts, business interests, real and personal property, trusts, RSUs, options, business interests. Financial impact can be having 2 attorneys and dueling expert fees. If forensic accounting is necessary, that can be costly. There's, of course, less income after the divorce to utilize for bills and expenditures, but on the other hand, the liabilities are usually shared, so that can help. During a divorce, you have the ability to access retirement funds without the withdrawal penalty, can transfer over with a quadro. There's also more financial aid based on custodial parents' income, so that's a positive. And this process I've found has been in most of my mediations, it provides the ability to budget, revisit the financial options and approaches, since usually one of the couples handles the checkbook or anything else, to try and learn about what this entails is really important. So I put together sort of an approximate cost for divorce. Mediation ranges from $3,000 to $10,000. Collaborative law usually goes from $10,000 to $18,000, and litigation is sky high, $20,000 and up. So kind of some key takeaways from all of this is that keeping the goal of achieving a fair settlement and reasonableness. Couples have options of how to approach the divorce and avoid the dreaded divorce war by instead utilizing amicable directions. And by choosing that right direction, a creative resolution can be achieved while maintaining joint control over the outcome. Key is education and patience is important. and making sure that you reach out to professionals to assist in determining your financial well-being. I always tell clients that they should have a board of directors, their own board of directors, their doctor, their financial advisor, their attorney, and all of them working together in a team approach. Some other kinds of things: consider pre and post-nuptial agreements. And most importantly, remember, although divorced, that still remains a family. It's just defined differently. So that's kind of a quick overview of what divorce in general.
That's great, Karen. Alex, do you want to hand me over the screen and I'll?
Yeah.
Good afternoon. Thanks everyone for joining us at this webinar on divorce and on using economics-based software to help people decide, first of all, whether they want to get divorced, and secondly, what kind of settlement they can reach without having a major fight between the two spouses. I want to first of all thank Karen Argetsinger, who's a terrific divorce mediator in Wellesley, Mass, has joined us today and told us some of the basics of divorce. I got into thinking about divorce when I actually got divorced myself, and I realized that economics-based software could dramatically help people in resolving some of the questions that they have when it comes to divorce. Are they being treated fairly? In particular, is the big question, or a big question, that arises in divorce, discussions. And I think a lot of these questions can be resolved with our software, with our economics-based software, so that we can minimize the amount of fighting over questions that can easily be answered impartially by sophisticated software. So I'm going to talk to you today about two software programs that my company, Economic Security Planning Inc., markets. One is called MaxiFi Planner. Most of you are probably familiar with that program. And the other program is called Analyze My Divorce Settlement. That's at analyzemydivorcesettlement.com. MaxiFi is at maxifiplanner.com. So let me start by saying something everybody knows, that divorce is a lot more common than we like to talk about. 40 to 50% of marriages are ending in divorce, and that doesn't make these divorces easy. They're tough under the best of circumstances, because people got married, hoping for a lifetime together, not to get divorced, right away, or 5 years later, or 20 years later. So emotionally, it's very difficult. Financially, it's very difficult, as I'll explain or describe in terms of an example, or demonstrate in terms of an example. And it's not just difficult for you, it's difficult for your spouse, it's difficult for your kids, for your family, your parents. You might have grown kids, it can be difficult for them. It's difficult for your friends who, feel they may need to choose sides once a couple has split up. So the best of all worlds is that the divorce ends amicably for everybody, for the kids, for the relatives, for you and your spouse. And that's what the goal of this webinar is, and why we generated the software, AnalyzeMyDivorceSettlement.com, because we want to try and eliminate divorce war. And I have a strategy to suggest to you to do that. It started out as a 3-part strategy. That's the bullet here, but it's actually now a 5-part strategy in the slides below. But one of the key messages I'm going to provide is not just, if you're going to get divorced, how to think about getting to an answer pretty quickly, getting to a settlement easily, but also, once you kind of figure out what a fair settlement is, then compare that settlement with your living standard, your living standard under the settlement. I want you to think about comparing the living standard under the settlement that you think is fair and that your spouse hopefully would also think is fair with your living standard if you stay together, if you don't get divorced, and that you can calculate easily in MaxiFi Planner. So the strategy here involves doing calculations about divorce and analyze my divorce settlement and .com, and then going to MaxiFiPlanner.com to look at your living standard as it now is going forward, and then think about whether or not you're willing to take what may be a significant living standard hit, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, from getting divorced, and whether the benefits from getting divorced exceed the cost. Now, this is just repeating in different words. Before you decide, do this cost-benefit analysis. Again, the cost of the divorce is really the reduction in your sustainable living standard. It's not just your living standard this year or next year, but over the rest of your life, because divorce can have long-term implications for you. And the benefit, on the other hand, as opposed to the cost, which is really a financial thing, a living standard, we're talking about your discretionary spending through time, your ability to acquire goods and services. And that's apart from your housing, which is also part really of your living standard. But I'm going to talk about these two things separately: housing, living standard, and also discretionary spending, the living standard afforded by that. But those are that change in your living standard, that's your cost. But the benefit here is really non-monetary. It's really a personal valuation. Somebody is unhappy if a divorce happens, and that unhappiness has to be set against the potential reduction in living standard that would arise. So we have these programs, and I'm going to refer to the Analyze My Divorce Settlement Program as just AMDS, and MaxiFi Planner is just MaxiFi to keep things simple. This slide is really kind of asking the question I was just referencing in more concrete terms. What if your sustainable living standard would drop by 50%? Is it worth it to get divorced? You might think that personal considerations, feelings, unhappiness can't be quantified. You can't put a dollar figure on it. But we economists, I'm an economist, think that's not the case. We think we're making decisions that compare dollars with feelings all the time. So we have a desire to have an extra child, but we think about, can we afford that child? We would love to take a vacation for 6 months. Can we afford to do that? We get divorced, we might in some ways be happier, might be, on balance, but is it worth a 50% decline in our living standard? Maybe it's only worth a 30% decline in our living standard. In that case, we need to know if it really is, if we're really talking about a 50% decline, because then we're going to decide not to get divorced, because we're only willing to give up a 30% of our living standard to get divorced. We're not willing to give up 50%, but maybe the cost is only 10%. So then it might make sense to get divorced. But in thinking about this benefit from getting divorced as a share of your pre-divorce living standard, you have to also include the benefit or harm to your children. Is this going to help your children or harm your children? Some children are, psychologically damaged by divorce for the rest of their life. It's not an easy thing for children necessarily. As many people who say, well, the kids will get over it. Some do and some don't. So you have to know what, have to think through what's best for your children as well as best for you in thinking about the total net benefit that you're going to be comparing with the cost of getting divorced. Now, so we're going to use analyze my divorce settlement to calculate the living standard when you're divorced, and we're going to compare that with the living standard when you're married using MaxiFi Planner. The difference between those two living standards, again, is the cost, and then you're going to compare that cost with your perceived benefit from getting divorced. Okay, now what I'm going to focus your attention on is the point that whenever you get divorced, there's going to be some settlement, and that settlement is going to entail some ratio of each spouse's living standard to the other. So, for example, the husband might end up with the settlement might entail the husband agreeing to having 75% of the living standard of the wife. Maybe that's for reasons that make sense to both parties. The wife might have a very high-powered job, be working 70 hours a week. The husband might be working part-time. The wife may plan to retire at 65. The husband plans to retire at 60. And so the wife may need to also be taking care of the kids and have less free time. There's lots of considerations that lead you to figure out what an appropriate target ratio would be. But in the end, it's always going to be some kind of a ratio. And that's what I want to focus your attention on some more here in my 5-step plan for deciding whether to divorce and how to make it fair. So if you're going to think about getting divorced, what I would propose as an economist, and I think most economists would push in the same direction, I would think about a fair ratio of post-divorce living standards between the two spouses. And we'll talk in a moment about what considerations would come into play in thinking about what a fair ratio would be. But once you have this ratio, you can use the software program, Analyze My Divorce Settlement, to look at a variety of settlements with this agreed upon ratio. Suppose the ratio is 1-to-1. Maybe we're talking about a couple that was married for 25 years, and they both think they should have the same living standard going forward. Maybe they got married at 40 years old, and now they're 65, they're getting divorced, but they feel it's appropriate for them both to have the same living standard. So then the level of the living standard will be determined by Analyze My Divorce Settlement, as we'll see in a moment. And then you can compare the level of that living standard with the level of the living standard if they stayed married by running MaxiFi Planner. Now, there's lots of ways to give both parties the same living standard. You could, let's say they had very different retirement account assets and very different Social Security benefits coming in. And maybe one of them has off the top medical expenses, which could be viewed as not really part of your living standard, just as really just an extra cost they face. Well, to get them the same level of discretionary spending going forward, which is what I'm referring to here in terms of a living standard, you could divide the retirement account assets unevenly. To make that happen, you could divide the regular assets, the non-tax favored assets, unevenly. You could provide, one spouse could provide alimony to the other. One spouse could let the other spouse stay in the marital home for a number of years, and that perhaps higher earning spouse could pay the upkeep and the property taxes for that home for a certain period of time. So there's lots of ways to get to a agreement, a settlement, in which the living standard ratio is what you want, which in this example is 1-to-1. So what you want to look then is at all these different settlements that are generating the target ratio, and then ask yourself the question, which of these settlement arrangements is going to produce the highest living standard for both people, because it's going to be the same living standard for each, because we use that ratio. So if it's higher for one, it's going to be higher for the other. So it might be a settlement that involves transferring retirement account assets from the high earner to the low earner, because that will reduce the couple's combined taxes going forward. Or it might involve alimony payments for a fixed number of years. Or it might involve redistributing sharing the regular assets in a non-50-50 manner. So there's lots of different ways, and they're going to have, each way that you construct a settlement is going to have different tax implications. And that means that you want to look for the one that has the lowest lifetime taxes for the couple combined, and that means the highest living standard for each spouse after they get divorced. Now, once you've found the best of these settlements that produces the same ratio, 1-to-1 in this case, then you go over to MaxiFi Planner and calculate the living standard for the couple if they're married, and then you can compare just subtract the living standard in analyze my divorce settlement from living standard MaxiFi Planner, and you have an answer for the cost. Now, what's involved in choosing a fair ratio? Well, the length of the marriage obviously matters. If you're just been married for 2 weeks, that's unfortunate that you're getting divorced, but it's not the same as if you've been married for 25 years. So most judges around the country, divorce judges, would say, well, look, I've been married for 2 weeks, just take your own assets and other property and separate and call it a day. There won't be any alimony. And if you have children, you have to share in the care of the children, but there won't be any maintenance of one spouse by the other. If, on the other hand, if you've been married for 20 years and one spouse sacrificed their career to bring up the children and let the other spouse become much more productive and have much higher earnings, then most judges around the country would say some kind of alimony is appropriate. And the amount of alimony that would be specified if it really went to court, which most divorces don't do, as Karen has indicated, most divorces settle out of court, but in certain states, the treatment of the lower earning spouse, the wife in general, is going to be much less generous than in other states. So if you're getting divorced in Texas, it's going to be a much less favorable outcome if you go in front of a judge than if you get divorced in Massachusetts in general. That's, I can't say that's true. And most states do not have alimony guidelines. It's really that they leave it up to the family court judge. I think there's only about 8 states that have guidelines. So anyway, thinking about what's a fair ratio, well, what state you're in getting divorced, where you decide to live will affect your divorce settlement potentially, because you may want to have this kind of a ratio, and your spouse may say, no, that's too generous to you, I'd like to have a less generous ratio. If you're in a state where that less generous ratio is likely to be approved by a judge, that may influence your thinking about how hard to fight for the ratio that you feel is appropriate. But anyway, length of marriage is consideration, what state you live in, who's working, how hard are they working, how long are they working, that's a consideration. If somebody's working, like a dog, and they're going to work for years after you've retired, maybe they are due to, it's justified to have a higher living standard. Maybe the ratio should be higher than 1. For, you know, their living standard to your living standard, that ratio should be bigger than 1. Also, who has to take care? Who's going to be having physical custody of the children? And you know, that's a plus, and it's also a minus in the sense that that person has to forgo the leisure free time they would otherwise have. So bringing up children is a pleasure, but it's also you know, an effort. So that has to come into play. Past contributions already mentioned. Somebody supported somebody's education, grievances. There may have been one party that acted poorly prior to their getting divorced, and maybe there should be some recompense for that. So I would say, you know, think through these things. You come up with a provisional ratio that both sides think are reasonably fair. Hopefully, both sides are kind of willing to work on this together. But you could certainly work on this on your own. If somebody's proposing something, you could run it through Analyze My Divorce Settlement, because it entails, in effect, some kind of a ratio of living standards. And then once you play with the program, get to the target ratio, you can again adjust different things, levers, hit the target, have different settlements that you can consider, and then you want to choose the one that has the highest living standard for a given ratio. Okay, so I'm going to take a case study here, Joe and Sally, and they're a 45-year-old couple. They're married got married at 25, so they're married for 20 years now. They're thinking about getting divorced. They have 2 kids, 10 and 15, and Sally's going to have physical custody. Both are going to retire at 62. Sally earns $200,000 a year, and Joe earns $50,000. Actually, sorry, it's $150,000 a year for Sally. I put the wrong number in the slide. Sally has $1 million in a 401k. Joe has $200,000 in a 401k. They have $200,000 in a checking account. They've got a $750,000 home with a $250,000 mortgage. And we're now going to use Analyze My Divorce Settlement to calculate a settlement for Sam and Sally, assuming a ratio of 0.75. So why did I choose 0.75 for this case study? Because let's just go back. Sally's earning, again, that number should say 150. We'll change the slide. When you get the slide, you'll say 150K per year, and Joe's earning 50K. So Sally has a very demanding job in this case. By assumption, she's working much harder than Joe, I'm assuming, and he agrees to this lower living standard. But again, that's just an example. So now let me go to the program here, which is Analyze My Divorce Settlement. And I've already set up Sam and Sally in this program. The program is very much like MaxiFi Planner, except we ask questions about what's going to happen when people get divorced. For example, we asked about their current residence, who's going to stay in the house, for how long, and then given that, who's going to pay the bills while that person's staying in the house, when will the house be sold, for how much will it be sold, how will the proceeds be divided. So we have questions like this that are coming up when a couple is getting divorced. And we're also assuming that you know, retirement account assets and other assets are going to be divided in a certain way. For example, we ask about assets. We say, okay, the two spouses together have 1.2 million in assets, but in this particular settlement that I'm going to look at to begin with, which is even Steven, just split the assets and call it a day. They both are going to get half of the assets. They're going to also sell the house immediately, and each they had a $750,000 house. They're going to sell it right away, and each buy a $375,000 house with half the annual costs for the housing. So all those kinds of questions are asked in the software. You know, you've got a house, when is it going to be sold, and who's going to get the who's going to share the expenses before it is sold, and then who's going to how are they going to share the proceeds from selling the home. That's another way you can produce this ratio that you're targeting to, which is give one of the spouses a bigger share of the proceeds from the sale of the house. But anyway, I'm going to just hit this button, analyze, and look at the relative living standard of the two spouses. If all they do is just share their assets, including their house, they sell the house, give each person half of the equity of the home, and then call it a day and go off on their own ways. Well, Sam's living standards down here, 28,000. Sally's is up at 58,000. So 27 is, you know, about half of 58,000. So this is not the ratio they're targeting for. So I set up another settlement, which I called Sam's living standard is 75% of Sally's. And in this case, I specified here under assets that Sam's going to get exactly 90. Let me just show you the number here that I use. He's going to get 91% of their combined retirement account assets when they get divorced. And even despite that, the fact that Sally's giving up a huge chunk of her 401k to Sam, she's still going to end up with a higher living standard. Sam's living standard now is 75% of Sally's. He's at 39,000, so his is higher and Sally's is lower. So, but the absolute amount of their living standard is based on all these inputs because they're effectively sharing these resources, and the resources are what they are. The earnings of the two people and the Social Security benefits they're going to be receiving, because I've entered a past covered earnings history for both of them, and they've got some regular assets, and they've got Medicare Part B premiums they have to pay in the future. So, and they have to, Sally has to pay for the children to make sure they have the same living standard as she does while they're living with her until they leave the home at age 19. So all those things are being factored in to play here. And you can see that, that's you know, those are the numbers. But the key, one important thing to think about here is they get to live on this amount. That's their discretionary spending each year. But they've lost economies of shared living. You know, Sally's going to need her car. Maybe they just had one car before that they could share. Now she's going to need a car and he's going to need a car. They used to be able to share leftovers. Can't do that anymore. Maybe they were similar in size and they were able to share clothes. They were able to share a hotel room when they go on vacation. So there's lots of economies of shared living that are going up in smoke when you get divorced. Now, the biggest economy of shared living that's going up in smoke when these two get divorced is their housing. They used to be able to live in a $750,000 house, which was presumably twice as big as the house they're now living in, had twice the size front yard and backyard, had twice the amenities. Now they're both in $375,000 homes. It is true that the expenses are half as big for each, but the space is you know, smaller. It's not as nice a home, clearly, as a house that's twice as expensive. So those are the two big hits from getting divorced. And to be a little more precise about this, let me go to MaxiFi Planner and run Sam and Sally staying married. And I set up the case of them being married, and I'm just going to run the, I put in the same inputs over here for the two of them, but then now they're not getting divorced. And then I run the report, and I look at the base plan, and what do I find? Well, I find that on an annual basis, let me just look at the chart here. This is when the kids are at home, they have to spend some more, but after the kids leave the household, the discretionary spending of the couple is about $84,000. That's not dramatically different than the discretionary spending of Sam and Sally when they were divorced, if you add up the two discretionary spendings. But because they don't have the economies of shared living, when I look at this chart rather than this chart is about, this chart that you're looking at now is about discretionary spending, but this chart is about living standard. And the living standard chart is adjusting for economies and shared living. So they're both enjoying about a $52,000 higher living standard once you take into account the economies of shared living, the fact that they can share expenses. And the assumption that's underlying this chart is the two can live as cheaply as 1.6. So 52.7 is higher than the number we had here, which is 49.8 for Sally and 37.4 for Sam. So even ignoring the housing, where they're going to take a big hit in the living standard with respect to housing services, they're taking a hit with respect to the living standard in terms of their discretionary spending, because they're not able to enjoy the economies of shared living. Again, if they stayed married, it's equivalent to them having, like being single, but having almost $53,000 a year to spend. Now they actually are single. Sally's spending about $50,000, not 53, and Sam's down at 37.5 or not at 53. So that's a pretty big difference, and that's primarily coming through the fact that they're not enjoying those economies of shared living. It's not because in absolute terms they're spending less. It's just that their spending is less efficient in producing a consumption, goods and services that they can enjoy, because they can't share in so many things that they were otherwise sharing. They used to have one TV. Now they're going to have two TVs. They used to have one electric bill. Now it's two electric bills. So all that spending becomes kind of duplicative when you get divorced. So I looked also at another settlement that I wanted to show you, which was trying to think about raising their living standards. So let me, So in this settlement, I keep hitting the wrong button, sorry. In this settlement, I've got the two of them still keeping the ratio of Sam's living standard to Sally's at 0.75 because they agreed that was a fair ratio. But now they think about, what if they both were to work till 65 rather than 62, and both were to take Social Security at 70 rather than at 62? How much better off would they be? Well, they'd be better off. Now we've got Sally up almost at the same living standard as she would have had they stayed married, and Sam's better off as well. And these are, if I compare these two, let me just show you side by side. You can see that both of these bars are higher. They don't look dramatically higher, but when you look at this on when you realize that the living standard, if they did this, if they worked longer and took Social Security later, they're getting this higher living standard for the rest of their life. They're getting that, what looks to be a small difference in the height of these columns, but for the next 55 years. So that translates into about a year's after-tax earnings for each person. So it's actually a very big deal were they to think about, hey, maybe we should both agree to work till 65 and take Social Security 70, because our benefit at 70 from Social Security will be 76% higher adjusted for inflation, because first of all, we won't have it reduced because we took it early. And secondly, between full retirement age and 70, our benefit is incremented every year by 8%, not compounded, but by 8% a year. Given our age, that means it's going to be 24% higher from age 60, because we're going to wait from age 67 or full retirement age till 70 to take that the Social Security benefit. So this is illustrating the ability of Analyze My Divorce Settlement. If the couple to optimize the household's decisions here, not just to kind of select the best way to raise Sam's living standard so that 75% of Sally's, or again, they could have chosen a different ratio like 1-to-1. Anyway, they chose 75%. But in addition, they can go beyond that to think about other decisions that will make them both better off, because if they keep this ratio fixed, then these columns are then going to move together upward. If they do anything that can increase their resources, lower their lifetime taxes, raise their lifetime benefits, that column can be higher. It could be that, for example, just one of them, like Sally, decides to wait till 70 to take Social Security. Well, that would allow Sam to have a higher living standard too. If Sam might be more, for whatever reason, cash constrained, Sally might be better able to afford to wait till 70 to take her benefits, even if they both retired at 62, and they both can benefit from that decision. So let me stop there, Alex, and we can turn back to you for Q&A. Thank you.